This is Tulani, and my apologies for not being on screen. I'm unable to be on screen right now. However, we are gathering, and we're going to talk about white male dominance, and not just white male dominance, but male dominance in general, and not just in the United States, but globally. But for some of us, we're going to focus some of our attention on the United States. We've never had a female president of the United States, and we've been trained to not think about it or talk about it. Most of the so-called Fortune 500 companies are dominated in their hierarchy by males, mostly white males. And again, we've trained ourselves to not talk about it. And for those of us who started thinking about it more, about male dominance and why it is, we've discovered that it's difficult to talk about because as cisgender men in a male dominated society, we've been trained to be quiet about it. So when we start to think about it or start to talk about it, we don't even know where to begin. So that's kind of that's kind of our starting point today, just naming that struggle.
Yeah, thanks, Tulani. This is Rick speaking. So, one of the things I've been thinking about a lot for the last little while is how I, this whole male dominance thing. In my case, it's a combination of whiteness and male dominance. Is not something abstract. It's not something that's out there. It's not just something that's that's in other people or somewhere else, but it's in me because of the ways in which I've been conditioned. And one of the one recent experience that really reminded me of this in sort of a way that wasn't something I'm proud of, but just last week I was with my family in the Palm Springs area in California, and we went one of the days we wanted to go for a hike in the Tahquitz Canyon, which is on the land of the Agua Caliente people, and it involved an admission, paying an admission fee at the visitor center, and so we did that, and we were in the process of doing that, and the woman who was behind the counter, she saw what I had. I had my birding scope with me, and she saw that, and she said, "Oh, we don't allow like cameras on the trail because it might be an obstacle for other people. The trail's fairly narrow," and so on and so forth. So she was explaining that, and my immediate response was to say, "This is not a camera. This is a scope. It's a birding scope," and I was, and at the time, I mean, it was just my immediate reaction, right? And almost as soon as I said that, and she said, "Okay," she says, you can, you just need to be careful as you walk the trail, so that, because it was on a tripod, right? And I think that was the point of that she was trying to make. And I said something to my daughter. My daughter was right there, and after that exchange, I was like, "Ah, man, was I disrespectful?" And she was like, "Yeah, that was kind of like mansplaining." And I was like, "Ah, damn," because it's like, anyway. So I was, I recognized it, and I did then apologize to the woman for being disrespectful, but it was just such a natural reaction on my part. Like, and I'm like, shit, like, I'm like, why is, I mean, I feel like I've been working on this stuff for a while, and yet I'm still, it's so deeply ingrained in me that those patterns, keep playing out. And so, yeah, it's for me, it's obviously something that I carry with me in my body, in my mind, in my spirit. And I just would like to get better at recognizing it and working at it in such a way that I don't keep repeating the same patterns over and over. So I'm going to leave it at that for now, but that's just something that I experienced very recently, and that, reminded me once again of how deeply ingrained these things are.
And that word you used in there, Rick, about it being natural, is like that's our natural reaction, but like, of course, it's not natural. Like it's completely, it's a completely socialized reaction. It's not about nature. But we've been trained to do this through the systems that, have taught us to expect, to be treated with deference, to be treated as if, we know things that we don't know, that our mediocrity is actually pretty good.
Yeah, I agree with all what you're saying. For me, some of that stuff's been harder to identify because I have had a harder time identifying or being able to look at what is internalized sexism, male dominance. Not that I do it super well with racism, but with white supremacy, the conversation it often feels a little bit more easily graspable. Again, not that I've transcended that, but I can more easily, it feels like, grasp culture and ethnicity that kind of surrounds white supremacy than I can with masculine dominance and male dominance and sexism. And I have found that for me that the learnings of internalized superiority around being a man I have found myself, like white people try to find BIPOC to make themselves feel better about being racist. I've found myself doing that over the years with sexism, kind of putting a woman or even a non-binary person or trans man in a place where they're almost defending my acting in a sexist way, if that makes sense. It's kind of using that to be like, well, like in Rick, in your example, in the past, I would do that similar thing, and I think, oh, I feel uncomfortable, but I'll look for an excuse by finding someone that isn't a white man to say, well, it probably wasn't that bad, that kind of thing. And so it's over the years, it's been harder for me to have this conversation, the thing that Talani led off with, because it's been harder to see. And I think part of that is because it's so internalized. I've not spent as much time with it as I have, perhaps other manifestations of internalized superiority. And I think part of it's that cultural thing, because the patriarchy and sexism is so rampant worldwide through many different cultures. I've just had a harder time pinpointing it in myself.
I think added to that, what you just said, Nick, about patriarchy globally, I think one of the culprits for us as men that have helped to embed that in our psyche and in our cultural DNA has been religion. I think especially for BIPOC men, and maybe not just for BIPOC men, but as an African American male, what I can acknowledge is that our internalized male superiority and our internalized and our misogyny has historically been wrapped in religion. We've wrapped it all up in religion, and it's biblical, and the role, these gender roles are have been determined by God, and everybody needs to, to stay in their place and stay in their role. And coincidentally, it means that men it means that men are on the top. And so
Yeah, I can, if you can come back on, Tony, please feel free. But I can see that because in my Jewish culture, again, Jews have a complicated relationship with white supremacy and racism. There are Black and brown Jews, so clearly there's racism within the Jewish community because there's white Jews. Yet it's not the same as a white Christian man. Yet sexism and patriarchy does thrive in the Jewish community, and so there's different ways that historically sexism has shown up that I think has more deeply. I don't know if I'm going to say more deeply. I'm not sure what I'm trying to say. It's been harder to see. It's been harder to root out myself, I guess, in some ways.
I feel
I
like,
wonder if that difficulty sometimes relates to the fact that we've all grown up around women and have learned certain patterns of behavior. Not every people within racial groups often grow up to some degree within their racial group. They're not necessarily on a daily basis interacting interpersonally with people from other racial groups, which creates a different dynamic for race and racism, perhaps, than the way that we're socialized within our own families. So I wonder if that makes it in some ways
I hear
a little
what
harder
you're saying.
to get at it.
Yeah.
yeah, I was just going to say, for me, it's really hard to separate my ingrained white supremacy from my ingrained patriarchy. Like they go hand in hand. And I think there's a reason for that, right? Like if we look at the history of this country, I mean, white Christianity had everything to do with the creation of white supremacy and patriarchy in this country from the start. And I mean, we passed laws, like horrific laws, back in the 1600s that legitimized and legalized rape. I mean, like it, like the Virginia law, I think it was, somewhere in the 1660s or something, that, people, the ruling, like the landowners, realized that they needed to pass certain laws to prevent well, they were passing all kinds of laws, right? The slave codes, servant codes, people call them different things, but I'm thinking of the law that was passed in Virginia, which stated that from that time on, children would take on the status of the mother. And on the face of it, like, you could read that and think, oh, well, what's like, so what, right? But like, the context for that was the context of indentured servitude, turning into enslavement of Africans, the African indentured servants, right? And wanting to continue, like, ensure an ongoing supply of people of African descent. So that's why, and it was also a way of legalizing the rape that was happening in the case of white masters, like the white landowners who were raping, African women of African descent. And they passed this law. I mean, it's just, and you go back to stuff like that and you realize this stuff is so deep. It's, yeah, which is why it's hard for me to separate the patriarchy thing from the white supremacy.
Yeah, I still struggle separating them. Yeah, I hear you. I was thinking, as you were talking, I was thinking about what Jelani opened up with, talking about the presidents. When you think about how deep sexism is and male dominance, we haven't had a female head of state, but we have elected a president with darker skin than all the other presidents, right? A biracial president with darker skin.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, what does that say about where we are? And again, I always have to try to disclaimer. I'm not trying to say we've gone anywhere with racism or white supremacy. There's no hierarchy there in terms of which is more impactful. I mean, it's not for me to say anyway, but yeah, I'm not sure. The history, though, what you're saying, Rick, the history is so powerful. The combination of both of them. I'm not adding anything. I'm just thinking out loud.
I think the other thing that we struggle with is as we are trying to enlighten ourselves and feel like we can be part of a movement. What does it mean for us individually to do our own work, right? To heal from this internalized superiority, this internalized male superiority, while at the same time finding out what and being faithful to our role for dismantling all of that bullshit in the places where we just named, in whatever our particular faith traditions are, and in politics and in business. What role should we be playing? Because as we're talking about race and racism, we very often talk about how it's important for white people to know their role, for white people to know how and when to be the risk takers. And on issues of gender oppression, we've not taken our role as we've not taken the lead in times when we should, and we because we don't know how, and we have definitely not taken on the role of risk takers, because when conversations about gender oppression are happening in the media, anywhere, it's usually women, you're right, talking about their oppression, and the voices of men are very often absent. The voices that actually need to be at the table are absent. How do we change that?
Right. And like white supremacy and our internalized, in the case of, in my case, my internalized racial superiority, I need to realize that patriarchy and male dominance and white male dominance are not good for me either, right?
Right.
Like it's a sickness, and I'm allowing myself to be dehumanized and damaged as long as I continue to remain silent, or am not assuming my responsibility and interrupting that continuous sort of cycle or pattern. So yeah, and it feels to me like part of our role is to is to name that, how this is not good for us as men, those of us who identify as men. Like, we need to this is about recovering our own humanity as men, interrupting male dominance, interrupting white male dominance. So yeah.
I agree with you, Rick. That's the self-interest piece, because any social justice issue that we are tackling, you can't do it from a position of a good deed doer, altruism. I'm doing it. We're doing it for the gals because the gals are being treated bad and we feel like we ought to help them. Because that's not going to get us anywhere. I think you're right that when we recognize how how these structures that we've been socialized in are harming everyone, all of us. It hurts men differently than it hurts women, of course, but that gives us a sense of or our motivation, I should say, is self-interest, not altruism.
My question, and this is exactly where I struggle with. I'm just to be open, is what that looks like for me. I've done. I feel like, yes, Rick, I agree, correct. I have an easier time naming where whiteness has harmed me and the work that I have to do there. And healing as we do the collective work, then I can't name that as easily when I'm looking at how I've been harmed by sexism and the patriarchy. It's harder for me, and I think part of it is because I can imagine a world free of white supremacy. We had many societies, right? It's been some time, but we've had many societies, and many are still there that are free or almost free of white supremacy historically. And it's not hard to see that. I have a harder time, and so that the byproduct of that is not that any one person can transcend race, but collectively, when we liberate ourselves from white supremacy, we're kind of going back to the way things were before white people colonized the world. But I'll still be a man. And so I have a harder time envisioning what my identity is as a man in a gender liberated society and world. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes total sense to me. And I mean, so I think for me, the task that we have for ourselves and for others is to redefine masculinity.
Yeah.
Like, what does it even mean to be a man?
Yeah.
Right.
There you go.
And I mean, the ways in which it's harmed me, like I can think back to my time at MCC, to be frank and honest. And I don't know how much you all are aware of, but halfway through my 5 years as anti-racism coordinator, I had to ask for a leave of absence. And the reason I had to ask for a leave of absence from MCC of 3 months was because I experienced depression for the first time in my life. And I mean, fortunately for me, the executive director at the time was understanding and was, gracious and granted me the leave of absence that I needed. What I realized during my time away, when I spent time with, some colleagues and friends and family, was that I was still, even though I paid lip service to doing the work collectively, you talked about the importance of doing it collectively, Nick, and even though I paid lip service to that, I realized that I was really still doing my work in a very individualistic way. And one of the difficult things about having to ask for a leave of absence and experiencing depression was that I had always been taught that, when the going gets tough, the tough get going, and that kind of BS, right? Like that's what I learned growing up. And I mean, for me, it comes back to what I said earlier, was I don't know how to separate the white supremacy part from the patriarchy and the like what it means to be a man, right? It means to be tough, it means to keep going, and it means to like not recognize your what's happening to you and your emotions, and anyway, all of that. And so, I mean, that's a very concrete example in my life where I experienced harm. And it was a hard thing. I mean, it was a really hard thing for me at the time.
Yeah. I appreciate you sharing that, Rick. Yeah, I can say briefly for myself in experience that I've had similar to that, where I've gotten close to and experienced depression. I've often attributed it to me being a white man and feeling. I think I often went more towards whiteness, maybe as an excuse to not look at the ways that I internalized, sexism. Maybe that's what I was doing. Yeah, I kind of felt like the depression that I was experiencing was brought about by because I was used to, you internalize superiority, so that if you're not experiencing that superiority, you begin to feel bad. You know what I mean? Because you're used to you expect people to respond to you a certain way, and you expect yourself to be able to manage things. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. Yeah, I appreciate that, Rick. Thank you for sharing that. I don't think I'd ever put it quite as much on the be tough, get it done, be a man side. Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah, thanks for articulating that, both of you. One way that I see masculinity hurting me, and I think this is pretty common because there's been a lot of research over the last number of years about men and their friendships, and how, like, a lot of men don't have very deep friendships with other men. And I think that is pretty directly connected to how we conceive of masculinity, and the withholding that is involved in that, because we can't make ourselves vulnerable, because it's about being that dominating personality or force that we will not be moved, and that really keeps us unable to have friendships beyond perhaps more surfacey, more sports based friendships and so on.
Yeah, that goes back to what Tulani first said, too, about it being so hard. That sounds like one of the reasons it's hard to talk about white male dominance, is because you got to be a man and not talk about real shit. So how do you ever get anywhere? Because you can't talk about things, especially with friends you don't have that you're not close to. Yeah, that's a good. Thanks.
Yeah, I could just imagine while sitting there watching the football game, watching the World Cup, you pass the salsa, and the chips, and then you say, hey, let's talk a little bit about white male dominance.
Yeah.
How you guys feeling about that? How you guys feeling about we spend a few minutes, because it's halftime now. How about we spend a few minutes talking about gender oppression?
Yeah.
You'd not be invited back to that game.
No, but I mean, and it's funny, and right, we're laughing about it, but it really is a question of, like, how do we normalize new ways of being as men, really, right? I think that, for me, that's the question. And I appreciated what you said about my use of the word natural earlier, Phil, because I think I agree with you. I just used the word.
Well, yeah.
And I think, I think people understand what I meant by that, but I agree that it's actually not natural. but it's something that we have normalized in our society. And what is the way to undo that? It's to start normalizing a different way of being, right? So, yeah.
Well, and that can bring us to our next or a future episode where we try to get back to folks from Human Up, my friends Adele and Ray, because that's what they're all about. They've been doing that for a long time, is try to normalize a new way of being a man. So that's a good lead into that, Rick.
Yeah. And maybe that means we brought our conversation this evening to a circle.
Sounds like it to me.
Sounds good.
It's been good.
Sounds good. I appreciate being with you all.
All right.
Do we
So
need to
the
leave a
cap-
long space to go ahead?
I was gonna say, to summarize, we just spent a whole bunch of time talking about how we don't know how to talk about this.
Yeah. Mission accomplished.
Exactly. Absolutely.